Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we're pulling back the curtain on two stories that reveal an uncomfortable truth about how power operates, from the sun-scorched fields of southern Morocco to the halls of the U.S. Department of Education.
And I'm Maya Clarity. These stories might seem worlds apart, Alex, but they share a common thread: ordinary people being squeezed by systems that were supposed to protect them, while the institutions responsible either look the other way or actively block anyone trying to hold them accountable.
Exactly right. In our first story tonight, we're heading to Morocco's Souss region, the agricultural engine that puts fresh tomatoes, citrus, and berries on European dinner tables year-round. But the workers who make that possible are reaching a breaking point, and their anger is spilling into the streets.
Then we turn to Washington, where ProPublica, one of the most respected investigative newsrooms in America, has been forced to sue the U.S. Department of Education just to get basic records about how discrimination complaints in schools are being handled. Or more accurately, how they're not being handled.
Two continents, two systems of power, one pattern. When vulnerable people demand their rights, the machinery of government and industry closes ranks. Stay with us, this is going to be a show you'll want to hear from start to finish.
Let's begin in Morocco. The Souss region sits in the country's southwest, stretching from the foothills of the Anti-Atlas Mountains to the Atlantic coast. If you've bought tomatoes, clementines, or blueberries in a European supermarket recently, there's a very good chance they came from here. According to Monde Diplo's March 2026 investigation, this region is Morocco's largest fruit and vegetable growing area, and the vast majority of what it produces is destined for export to Europe.
And when we say largest, we're talking about an operation of staggering scale. Morocco has positioned itself as Europe's garden, a year-round supplier of fresh produce that European farms simply cannot match during winter months. The Souss region is the crown jewel of that strategy. But here's the question Le Monde Diplomatique is asking, and it's a devastating one: who actually benefits from all this agricultural wealth?
The answer, according to their reporting, is decidedly not the workers. The people who plant, tend, harvest, and pack these fruits and vegetables, the human beings whose labor makes the entire export machine function, see remarkably little of the wealth they generate. We're talking about a region that produces billions of dirhams worth of agricultural exports, yet the workforce behind it lives in conditions that would shock most European consumers picking up those same products at their local grocery store.
And that disconnect between the wealth being generated and the poverty of the workers generating it has finally reached a tipping point. Protests have been growing across the region, with agricultural laborers demanding better wages, safer working conditions, and basic dignity. These aren't spontaneous outbursts. This is organized, sustained anger from people who have watched their region become an export powerhouse while their own lives have barely improved.
Let's talk about what these conditions actually look like on the ground, Alex, because the details matter. Agricultural work in Souss is brutally physical. Workers spend long hours in intense heat, often with inadequate access to water, shade, or rest breaks. Many are employed on temporary or informal contracts that offer no job security, no benefits, and no legal protections. Women make up a significant portion of this workforce, and they face additional layers of vulnerability, lower pay, harassment, and the constant threat of dismissal if they speak up.
The wage picture is particularly damning. Morocco's minimum wage for agricultural workers has historically been set lower than the minimum wage for other sectors, a built-in inequality that tells you exactly how the system values farm labor. Even that lower minimum is frequently violated, with workers reporting that they're paid below the legal floor, forced to work unpaid overtime, or cheated through piecework arrangements that make it nearly impossible to earn a living wage.
And here's where the European connection becomes critical. These aren't subsistence farms producing for local markets. This is industrial-scale agriculture integrated into European supply chains. Major European retailers and distributors source from Souss. European trade agreements with Morocco have facilitated and encouraged this agricultural export model. European consumers are, whether they know it or not, the endpoint customers of this labor exploitation.
So when we ask who benefits, the answer starts to become very clear. European agribusiness companies benefit from access to cheap produce. Moroccan agricultural exporters, many of them large, politically connected operations, benefit from favorable trade terms and a workforce with limited bargaining power. European consumers benefit from year-round access to affordable fresh fruits and vegetables. The people who do not benefit are the workers themselves.
The protest movement that Le Monde Diplomatique documents is rooted in this fundamental injustice. Workers in Morocco's rural heartland are not asking for anything radical. They want wages that reflect the value they create. They want contracts that provide basic security. They want working conditions that don't destroy their health. They want the right to organize and advocate for themselves without facing retaliation. These are demands that most Europeans would consider baseline expectations in their own workplaces.
But what makes these protests particularly significant is the political context. Morocco has invested heavily in its image as a stable, modernizing country, a reliable partner for Europe and a model for the region. The agricultural export sector is central to that narrative. It's supposed to demonstrate that trade liberalization and foreign investment lift all boats. The growing unrest in Souss directly contradicts that story, and that makes it politically uncomfortable for Rabat.
There's also a water dimension to this story that cannot be ignored. Souss is one of the most water-stressed regions in an increasingly water-stressed country. Industrial agriculture consumes enormous quantities of water, for irrigation, for processing, for the greenhouses that extend growing seasons. Aquifers in the region have been dropping for years. The environmental cost of this export model is being borne locally, by communities that see their water tables fall while the profits flow elsewhere.
So you have a convergence of crises, labor exploitation, environmental degradation, and political frustration, all centered on an agricultural system designed primarily to serve European markets. The workers protesting in Souss are essentially saying, this model is broken. It extracts our labor, depletes our water, enriches a small elite, and leaves us with almost nothing. And they are right to be angry.
What's particularly striking is how invisible this story has been in European media. Consumers who care deeply about where their food comes from, who buy organic and check labels for country of origin, are largely unaware of the human cost embedded in that Moroccan tomato or that perfectly packaged punnet of blueberries. Le Monde Diplomatic's reporting is a vital corrective to that ignorance, and it raises uncomfortable questions about the ethics of Europe's food supply chain.
And it connects to a broader pattern we see globally, the externalization of costs. Wealthy countries and corporations have become extraordinarily skilled at pushing the true costs of production onto workers, communities, and ecosystems in less powerful countries. The price on the supermarket shelf doesn't reflect the real price. It doesn't include the unpaid overtime, the depleted aquifer, the workers' chronic back pain. Those costs are real, but they're invisible to the end consumer.
The question now is whether these protests will force meaningful change or whether they'll be suppressed, co-opted, or simply ignored. History suggests that agricultural workers in export-oriented economies face enormous structural barriers to improving their conditions. The entire system, trade agreements, supply chain dynamics, political incentives, is weighted against them. But history also shows that sustained collective action can shift those dynamics, especially when it draws international attention.
Let's hope this reporting from Le Monde Diplomatique contributes to that attention. Now, Maya, let's turn to our second story, and we're crossing the Atlantic to Washington, D.C., where a different kind of institutional failure is playing out, one that directly affects millions of American schoolchildren.
That's right, Alex. ProPublica, the Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative newsroom, has filed a federal lawsuit against the U.S. Department of Education. The reason? The department has been withholding records that ProPublica requested about how its Office for Civil Rights handles, or fails to handle, complaints of discrimination in the nation's schools. This is a story about transparency, accountability, and what happens when the agency responsible for protecting children from discrimination goes dark.
Let's set the stage here. The Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, commonly known as OCR, has a specific and critical mandate. It is the federal agency responsible for ensuring that schools receiving federal funding comply with civil rights laws. That means investigating complaints about racial discrimination, sexual harassment, disability discrimination, and other forms of bias in educational settings. For millions of students, OCR is supposed to be the last line of defense.
ProPublica, as they reported, filed Freedom of Information Act requests seeking records about OCR's operations, the kind of basic government transparency that FOIA was designed to ensure. They wanted to understand how the office was processing discrimination complaints, what was happening to the caseload, and how policy decisions were affecting enforcement. These are questions that any journalist, any citizen, has a right to ask, and that the government has a legal obligation to answer.
But according to ProPublica's reporting, the Department of Education has stonewalled. Records that should have been produced under FOIA have been withheld, delayed, or simply ignored. This isn't a case of a slow bureaucracy. This appears to be a deliberate refusal to provide information that the public is legally entitled to see. And when a federal agency refuses to comply with transparency laws, there's usually a reason. They're hiding something.
That's exactly why ProPublica has been forced to take the extraordinary step of filing a lawsuit. And let's be clear about what this means. A major news organization is spending its limited resources on litigation because the federal government won't follow its own transparency laws. ProPublica shouldn't have to sue to get these records. The fact that they do tells you everything about how this administration views public accountability.
The timing of this lawsuit is deeply significant. The Office for Civil Rights has been the subject of growing concern among civil rights advocates, educators, and parents. Under the current administration, there have been widespread reports of changes in how OCR operates, shifts in enforcement priorities, changes to how complaints are processed, and a general sense that the office's mission has been fundamentally altered. The records ProPublica is seeking could shed light on exactly what has changed and how it affects students.
And we need to talk about the human stakes here, Alex, because this isn't an abstract bureaucratic dispute. Every complaint that OCR receives represents a real child in a real school who has experienced discrimination. A black student subjected to racial harassment. A girl facing sexual assault with an inadequate school response. A student with disabilities denied the accommodations they're legally entitled to. These are vulnerable young people who turn to the federal government for help, and the question is whether that help is actually coming.
The pattern of withholding information is itself a form of harm. When the government refuses to disclose how it handles civil rights complaints, it prevents the public from knowing whether the system is working. Parents can't make informed decisions. Advocacy organizations can't identify systemic problems. Congress can't conduct meaningful oversight. The information vacuum benefits only those who prefer to operate without scrutiny.
ProPublica has built a remarkable track record of using public records to expose failures in government civil rights enforcement. Their previous reporting has revealed backlogs, understaffing, and policy changes that effectively gutted enforcement in various federal agencies. The fact that the Department of Education is fighting so hard to keep these particular records hidden suggests that what ProPublica would find could be deeply embarrassing, or worse.
Let's connect this to the broader political landscape. The Office for Civil Rights doesn't operate in a vacuum. Its priorities, its staffing levels, its enforcement philosophy, all of these are shaped by the political leadership of the Department of Education and ultimately by the White House. When an administration signals that civil rights enforcement is not a priority, the effects cascade through the entire system. Complaints pile up. Investigations are slow-walked. Settlements become weaker. And students suffer.
There's also a chilling effect to consider. When word gets out that the federal government isn't aggressively pursuing discrimination complaints, it sends a message to school administrators across the country. Some will take it as permission to be less vigilant about civil rights compliance. Others will simply conclude that there are no consequences for failing to address discrimination. Either way, students lose the protection they're supposed to have.
And this is where the FOIA lawsuit becomes more than just a transparency issue, it's a civil rights issue in its own right. Access to information about how the government enforces civil rights laws is itself a civil rights concern. When the public can't see what the government is doing, the government can do whatever it wants. That's not democracy, that's opacity serving power.
What ProPublica is doing here is exactly what the founders of FOIA envisioned: journalists using transparency laws to hold the government accountable on behalf of the public. The fact that they have to go to court to exercise that right is a failure of the system. But their willingness to fight for these records is a reminder of why independent investigative journalism matters so much, especially in moments when government transparency is under assault.
I want to underscore something about the institutional pattern here. The Department of Education is not some rogue agency, it is following a playbook that we've seen across the federal government. Slow-walk FOIA requests. Claim exemptions that don't apply. Force journalists and advocacy groups to spend years and thousands of dollars in litigation just to get basic records. The goal is to make transparency so expensive and time-consuming that most people simply give up. ProPublica hasn't given up, and that matters.
The potential consequences of what these records might reveal are significant. If OCR has been systematically deprioritizing certain types of discrimination complaints, whether based on race, sex, disability, or any other protected category, that would represent a fundamental betrayal of the office's mission. It would mean that the federal government has effectively told certain groups of students that their civil rights don't matter as much.
And if that's what the records show, the public absolutely has a right to know. Schools that receive federal funding, which is virtually every public school in America, are bound by civil rights laws. The enforcement of those laws isn't optional. It's not a policy preference. It's a legal obligation. If the agency responsible for enforcement has abandoned that obligation, the American people deserve to see the evidence.
We should note that this lawsuit is part of a larger trend of news organizations having to fight harder than ever for basic government records. FOIA compliance across the federal government has deteriorated significantly. Response times are longer, redactions are heavier, and agencies are increasingly willing to simply ignore requests and dare journalists to sue. It's a strategy of attrition, and it works against smaller outlets that can't afford litigation.
Now, Maya, let's step back and look at these two stories together, because I think the connections are profound and deeply revealing about how power operates in the 21st century.
Absolutely, Alex. On the surface, you have agricultural workers in southern Morocco and schoolchildren in the United States. Different countries, different issues, different scales. But look at the structural dynamics, and the similarities are striking. In both cases, you have vulnerable populations whose rights are being systematically undermined by the very institutions that are supposed to protect them.
In Morocco, the agricultural system is supposed to create prosperity that lifts the entire region. Instead, it funnels wealth upward to exporters and outward to European markets while leaving workers in poverty. In the United States, the Office for Civil Rights is supposed to protect students from discrimination. Instead, it appears to be retreating from that mission while actively blocking the public from seeing the evidence.
Both stories are also fundamentally about transparency, or the lack of it. European consumers don't see the labor conditions behind their produce. American parents don't see how the government handles discrimination complaints about their children's schools. In both cases, that lack of visibility is not accidental. It serves the interests of those in power. Invisibility is a feature, not a bug.
And in both cases, it takes extraordinary effort from journalists and activists to pierce that veil. Le Monde Diplomatique sends reporters to the fields of Souss-Massa. ProPublica files federal lawsuits to pry records out of the Department of Education. This is what it takes to get basic information about how systems that affect millions of people actually operate. That should alarm everyone, regardless of political orientation.
There's another thread connecting these stories, the externalization of harm. In Morocco, the cost of cheap European produce is externalized onto workers and ecosystems in the global south. In the United States, the cost of weakened civil rights enforcement is externalized onto the most vulnerable students, disproportionately students of color, students with disabilities, and students from low-income communities. In both cases, the people who bear the heaviest costs have the least political power to change the system.
And I think there's a deeper point about the nature of rights in a globalized economy. Rights, whether labor rights in Morocco or civil rights in the United States, are only as strong as the institutions that enforce them. When those institutions are captured by the interests they're supposed to regulate, or when they simply stop doing their job, rights become words on paper. The workers in Souss-Massa have labor rights in theory. American students have civil rights protections in law. But theory and law mean nothing without enforcement.
That's the fundamental insight these stories share. Rights without enforcement are just promises. And when governments choose not to enforce, or actively obstruct the public's ability to see whether enforcement is happening, they are choosing to abandon the people they serve. That's not governance. That's abdication.
The question we should all be asking is, who benefits from this abdication? In Morocco, it's the agricultural elite and European importers. In the United States, it's school administrators and officials who would rather not deal with the messy, difficult work of addressing discrimination. In both cases, the beneficiaries of inaction are already powerful. The victims of inaction are already vulnerable. The system isn't broken, it's working exactly as designed for the people who designed it.
And that's why the responses we're seeing through protests in Souss-Massa, lawsuits from ProPublica, are so important. They represent ordinary people and institutions of accountability refusing to accept the status quo. They are demanding that rights be treated as obligations, not suggestions. That transparency be the norm, not the exception. That power be accountable, not insulated.
Before we go tonight, I want to leave our viewers with this thought. Both of these stories are still developing. The protests in Morocco are ongoing, and their outcome will depend in part on whether international consumers and European policymakers pay attention to the conditions behind their food supply. ProPublica's lawsuit will work its way through the courts, and what those records ultimately reveal could reshape public understanding of how civil rights enforcement works, or doesn't, in American schools.
What you can do is straightforward. Read the original reporting, Le Monde Diplomatique's investigation from their March issue, and ProPublica's coverage of their FOIA lawsuit. Think about the supply chains you participate in as a consumer. Ask questions about where your food comes from and who picked it. If you're a parent, find out how your school district handles discrimination complaints. Demand transparency from your elected officials. These are not abstract policy issues, they affect real people, real children, real families.
And support the journalism that makes this kind of accountability possible. Independent investigative outlets like Le Monde Diplomatique and ProPublica are not funded by the systems they investigate. They depend on readers who believe that the truth matters, even when, especially when, the truth is uncomfortable. Without them, these stories go untold, these workers remain invisible, and these records stay buried.
That's our show for tonight. We covered the growing labor unrest in Morocco's Souss-Massa agricultural heartland, where workers who feed Europe are demanding a share of the wealth they create. And we covered ProPublica's federal lawsuit against the Department of Education, fighting for records about how discrimination complaints in schools are being handled or ignored.
2 stories, 1 pattern. When institutions fail the vulnerable, it takes courage, organization, and relentless pressure to hold them accountable. Tonight, we saw that courage in the fields of Morocco and the courtrooms of Washington. The question is whether the rest of us will pay attention.
For Truth Report, I'm Maya Clarity.
And I'm Alex Truth. Stay informed, stay critical, and we'll see you next time.